After studying this module, you shall be able to understand the factors that affect investors' decisions to hold foreign bonds. Know about the covered and uncovered interest parity conditions. Learn about the relation between interest rates and exchange rates in an open economy. Understand the asset transactions and consequent capital flows affect the spot and forward exchange rates. See how investors can hedge against exchange rate risk. Learn about some important factors that affect fluctuations in the exchange rate under a flexible rate regime with unrestricted capital flows. Know about the implications of the interest parity conditions under a system of fixed exchange rates. In this module, we will be studying about the interest rate on assets, which plays a crucial role in affecting the exchange rate in an open economy. The interest parity condition involving the rate of interest and exchange rate will be the focus of our discussion. The foreign exchange market is like any other market with a demand and supply side where different players participate to purchase and sell foreign currency. Equilibrium in the market is affected by the demand and supply of foreign exchange that arises owing to cross-border trade in goods, services and in assets. This equilibrium is disturbed by inter alia any change in domestic or foreign rates of interest and also by factors that cause changes in expected returns from assets, domestic or foreign, especially under conditions of unfettered international capital mobility. As domestic and foreign investors make changes in their portfolios, there are corresponding capital inflows and outflows that affect the exchange rates. As in the previous modules, throughout this module, also we define the exchange rate, that is E, in terms of number of units of domestic currency, that is rupees, required to buy 1 unit of the foreign currency, that is dollar. That is, the exchange rate is defined in terms of rupee per dollar. So, when the spot or forward exchange rate rises to rupees 60 or $60 from rupees 50 or $50, this reflects a depreciation of rupee per dollar. For simplicity of exposition, we assume that India is the home country, that is, rupee is the domestic currency and USA is a foreign country, that is, dollar is the foreign currency. Then we have covered interest parity conditions. In an open economy, agents not only engage in international trade in goods and services, but they also engage in sale and purchase of foreign assets. In a closed economy, agents have the choice of holding their wealth in the form of money or domestic bonds. In an open economy, agents make an additional decision, namely, they choose whether to hold foreign or domestic bonds. We assume that agents do not hold money in the form of foreign currency as it cannot be used to make purchases in the domestic market. The covered interest parity condition basically states that in a world with free cross-border capital mobility, returns on assets denominated in different currencies are the same when investors cover the risk from the possible currency fluctuations. So, the CIP is essentially a risk-free arbitrage condition. Think of an investor purchasing a foreign asset. He has to buy dollars in exchange of rupees at the spot exchange rate to pay for the asset. At maturity, the investor will then sell dollars to convert his dollar earnings into rupees. There are two aspects of this transaction that you should note and that will be incorporated within the concept of CIP. First, the investor will compare the earnings from a domestic asset of same type and maturity with the rupee earnings from the foreign asset while deciding whether or not to purchase it. Secondly, earnings from foreign asset may be subject to currency risk. That is, the investor will buy dollars at the spot exchange rate while purchasing the foreign asset. However, when the asset matures at a future date, there may be a drastic change in the rupee per dollar exchange rate owing to currency fluctuations that would affect the expected earnings from the foreign asset and render it quite risky. To ensure against such currency risk, investors may choose to write a forward contract wherein they would sell dollars and purchase rupee to convert dollar earnings into rupees at a predetermined rate or the forward exchange rate. Suppose an Indian investor has 1 rupee With this, he can buy an Indian bond that matures in 6 months and yields a semi-annual interest rate of I, so that at the end of 6 months, he would get a return of rupees 1 plus I. Alternatively, with 1 rupee, the investor could buy 1/E dollar. At the prevalent exchange rate of rupees E per dollar, he could invest 1 by E dollar in a 6-month US bond that would yield 1 plus I raised to power R divided by E dollars at maturity, where I raised to power F is the semi-annual rate of return on the American asset. To cover for exchange rate risk, the investor would enter into a forward contract to convert his future dollar earnings into rupees at the forward rupee per dollar exchange rate F. So at maturity, after 6 months, he would earn a risk-free, that is free from exchange rate risk, return of rupees F. This is multiplied by 1 plus I raised to power F divided by E from the foreign bond. According to CIP condition, with unrestricted capital flows, interest arbitrage would ensure that return of the domestic and foreign bonds would be the same, that is the risk-free return on the domestic bond, that is 1 plus I, would equal that on the foreign bond, that is F, multiplied by 1 plus I raised to power F divided by E when converted to a single currency, that is rupees in this case. So, the CIP states that the following equation would hold in a world characterized by unfettered capital mobility, shown by the formula 1 plus I is equal to F within bracket 1 plus I raised to power F divided by E. In case this condition is violated and say returns on foreign assets are higher than that on domestic assets, in this case capital would flow into the US economy, leading to an appreciation of the dollar and corresponding depreciation of the rupee, that is rise in E, that would tend to restore the equality. In other words, the CIP represents an equilibrium condition with respect to international capital movements, and any divergence from it creates opportunities for arbitrage, unleashes capital flows and exchange rate movements that tend to restore equilibrium.
The CIP condition may also be rewritten as follows: 1 plus I is equal to function of 1 plus I raised to power F divided by E. It is equal to 1 plus I raised to power F multiplied by 1 plus F divided by E minus E divided by E, or 1 plus I is equal to 1 plus I raised to power F multiplied by 1 plus within bracket F minus E close the bracket divided by E, or 1 plus I is equal to 1 plus I raised to power F multiplied by 1 plus F raised to power P, where F raised to power P is equal to F minus E divided by E. It is the forward premium on the rupee. This may be further rewritten as 1 plus I is equal to 1 plus I raised to power F multiplied by 1 plus F raised to power P is equal to 1 plus I raised to power F plus F raised to power P plus I raised to power F, F raised to power P, where I raised to power F, F raised to power P is essentially a very small term close to zero, which can be ignored to obtain the following approximation: 1 plus I is equal to 1 plus I raised to power F plus F raised to power P, or I is equal to I raised to power F plus F raised to power P. This is the first equation.
So, the CIP condition may be restated as a relation between the domestic and foreign rates of interest on similar assets and the forward premium on the exchange rate that measures the difference of the forward rate from the spot rate in percentage terms. It states that the domestic rate of interest is equal to foreign rate of interest plus the forward premium. This implies if the interest rate on 6 months treasury bill is 9% in the US and 7% in India, then the 6-month forward rupee per dollar exchange rate F is 2% below the spot rate, that is E, denoting an appreciation of the rupee in the forward market. Since interest rate on US bond is higher, there would be relatively high demand for these bonds, which would increase the volume of dollars for sale in the forward market as dollar earnings are converted into rupees, thereby creating pressure for depreciation of the dollar and corresponding appreciation of rupee in the forward market. In the spot market, demand for US bonds would lead to an appreciation of the dollar, making it more costly to acquire US bonds and corresponding depreciation of the rupee, bringing the returns on US and Indian bonds closer. This process would ensure that the CIP condition is satisfied and the risk-free return on the Indian bond, that is I, and the US bond, that is I raised to power F plus F raised to power P, is equalized in a world where capital is fully mobile between the two countries. In the above example, consider the case where F raised to power P is not 2%, rather it is less, say 0, that is say F is equal to E. In this case, risk-free arbitrage opportunities would be available and investors would borrow from India at 7%, buy dollars and invest these in US bonds at 9% and use the proceeds converting them into rupees at the forward exchange rate to repay the loan 6 months later, making a net profit equivalent to the interest rate differential. Obviously, such risk-free arbitrage opportunities will be grabbed and there will be a pressure in the forward market to sell dollars and buy rupees forward. This would create a tendency for the dollar to depreciate and the rupee to appreciate in the forward market, so that F would fall, and when F minus E divided by E is equal to F raised to power P is equal to minus 2%, equilibrium would be restored at the risk-free returns on the Indian and US bonds would be equalized, that is 7 is equal to 9 minus 2, and the CIP conditions would hold. Now we move on to uncovered interest parity conditions. The CIP condition discussed above captures the risk-free return on domestic vis-a-vis foreign assets wherein individuals cover for exchange rate risk by entering into a forward contract. However, the uncovered interest parity condition captures the behavior of risk-neutral investors who do not cover for possible currency fluctuations and enter into overseas asset transactions based on expectations of future gains. So in this case, investors do not sell forward equivalent amount of foreign currency to purchase domestic currency to safeguard against the possible currency volatility, and the UIP condition may be stated as follows. It is shown in the equation form on your screen.
1 plus I is equal to e raised to power e within bracket 1 plus I raised to power f divided by e, where e raised to power e is the expected future spot
Rupee per dollar.
exchange rate.
Similar to the case we discussed above, consider an Indian investor who is planning to hold bonds worth rupee 1. The expected return on domestic asset after 6 months is 1 plus I, where I is the semi-annual domestic interest rate. Since the investor is risk neutral, she is only concerned about the expected returns on the foreign asset. This is given by e raised to power e within bracket 1 plus I raised to power f divided by e. With 1 rupee, the investor can purchase 1 by e dollars and buy 6 months US bond with a yield of I raised to power f to earn 1 plus I raised to power f divided by e in dollar terms 6 months later. In rupee terms, she therefore expects to earn rupee e raised to power e within bracket 1 plus I raised to power f divided by e from the foreign investment, where e raised to power e is the rupee per dollar that she currently expects will prevail 6 months later. According to the UIP condition, the return on domestic bonds must be at least equal to the expected return on comparable foreign bonds as shown in the equation form on your screen.
1 plus I is equal to e raised to power e within bracket 1 plus I raised to power f divided by e. Using algebraic manipulation similar to what we used above for the CIP condition, we can rewrite the UIP condition as follows. 1 plus I is equal to e raised to power e within bracket 1 plus I raised to power f divided by e is equal to 1 plus I raised to power f multiplied by 1 plus e raised to power e divided by e minus e divided by e, or 1 plus I is equal to 1 plus I raised to power f multiplied by 1 plus within bracket e raised to power e minus e close the bracket divided by e, or 1 plus I is equal to 1 plus I raised to power f multiplied by 1 plus d, where d is equal to e raised to power e minus e divided by e is the expected depreciation of the rupee. This may be further rewritten as 1 plus I is equal to 1 plus I raised to power f multiplied by 1 plus d is equal to 1 plus I raised to power f plus d plus I raised to power f multiplied by d, where I raised to power f multiplied by d is essentially a very small term close to 0 which can be ignored to obtain the following approximation. 1 plus I is equal to 1 plus I raised to power f plus d, or I is equal to I raised to power f plus d is the second equation.
Using the above expression, we can say that if the domestic interest rate is higher than the foreign interest rate by say 2 percentage point, that means the domestic currency is expected to depreciate by 2%. So when the investors do not cover against possible currency fluctuations, the above UIP condition implies that they are expecting maximum depreciation of the domestic currency to the extent of the wedge between the domestic and the foreign interest rate. The UIP condition essentially implies that with unfettered capital mobility and with risk neutral agents, a high rate of interest on, say, the domestic asset is necessary to compensate for the risk of depreciation of the home currency in the future. Putting this in another way, the UIP condition helps us appreciate why investors are keen to hold certain assets like US Treasury bills despite their relatively low yield. This is because the dollar is a very stable currency, whereas many emerging market bonds must offer a very high return to compensate for the risk of depreciation of their currencies vis-a-vis the dollar. Now we move on to implications of the interest parity conditions. In the covered interest parity condition discussed above, we have seen how interest arbitrage opportunities lead to equalization of risk-free rates of return on domestic and foreign assets under conditions of unrestricted international capital flows. In this case, investors hedge against foreign exchange risk by entering into forward contracts. In the uncovered interest parity conditions, risk neutral investors expect a depreciation of the currency assets denominated in which have a higher interest rate. We will now examine a few implications of the interest parity conditions, especially for factors that impact on exchange rates. Note, so far our implicit assumption is that exchange rates are flexible. We'll discuss the case of interest parity and what it implies in a fixed exchange rate regime in the following section. First of all, note that according to the expectations theory, forward rates reflect agents' expectation about the future. Applying this idea, we can see that when the expectation theory holds, the forward exchange rate for a currency is essentially the same as the expected future spot rate. In this case, the expected future spot rate would be equal to the forward rate, that is f is equal to e raised to power e, so that CIP equation 1 and UIP equation 2 conditions are identical. The interest parity condition also highlight the factors that impact on exchange rates. Consider the UIP condition that may be written as follows as shown on your screens.
1 plus I is equal to e raised to power e within bracket 1 plus I raised to power f divided by e, or e is equal to e raised to power e within bracket 1 plus I raised to power f divided by 1 plus I. This is the third equation.
From equation third above, it becomes clear that the spot rate is a function of the expected rate of currency depreciation D, the foreign interest rate I raised to power f, and the domestic rate of interest, that is I. We will now try to understand how each one of these variables is likely to affect the spot rate under a flexible exchange rate regime. Let E be the rupee per dollar spot rate. Suppose the extent of expected rupee depreciation increases from say 2% to 4%. Given other factors, that is I raised to power f and I, how would this affect the spot rate today? At unchanged rates of interest, a higher expected depreciation of the rupee would lead to an increase in expected returns on the dollar denominated US assets, that is e raised to power e within bracket 1 plus I raised to power f divided by e. This is greater than as compared to 1 plus I. This would trigger capital outflows from the domestic economy, and the consequent increase in demand for dollars and corresponding supply of rupees would result in appreciation of the dollar and depreciation of the rupee, and hence lead to an increase in the spot rate. In equation 3, e raised to power e appears in the numerator on the right hand side, clearly showing that it has a positive relation with e. So, ceteris paribus, any increase, decrease in e raised to power e leads to a proportionate increase or decrease in e. Using similar logic, we can explain the positive relation between the yield on foreign assets I raised to power f and the spot rate e. Higher yield on foreign assets, ceteris paribus, would lead to relatively lower returns on domestic assets. This would also trigger capital outflows, leading to a depreciation of the domestic currency and hence leading to a higher spot rate. A similar outcome would be observed with a lower domestic rate of interest, ceteris paribus. A lower yield on domestic bonds makes foreign assets more attractive, leading to capital outflows, higher demand for dollars, and excess supply of rupees, and to a depreciation of the rupee per dollar spot rate. As you can see in the equation third, the yield on domestic bonds I appears in the denominator on the right hand side, so a lower value of I must lead to a higher value of E, that is I and E are inversely related in an open economy with unfettered capital flows and a flexible exchange rate regime where the interest parity condition is satisfied. So far, while deriving the UIP condition, we assumed that investors are risk neutral. But if investors are risk averse, then they would require an additional risk premium which would have to be incorporated as part of the return on the riskier asset to formulate the interest parity condition. The risk may be in the form of currency risk or country risk. For example, a foreign nation might impose restrictions on repatriation of earnings. In this case, the return on the riskier asset, say the domestic asset, must be high enough to equal the expected return on the foreign asset plus a risk premium. Most economies nowadays have adopted a managed float so far as the exchange rate regime is concerned. In the light of our discussion above, you should now be in a position to appreciate the challenges faced by central banks as they formulate interest rate policies in an attempt to address objectives such as control of inflation. Clearly, if the economy has eased restrictions on capital flows, changes in interest rates will also have implications for the exchange rate that must be factored in by policymakers. For instance, the central bank might raise interest rates in an attempt to curb high inflation, but this might lead to capital inflows and lead to a currency appreciation. An appreciation may have an adverse impact on exports that may be undesirable, especially if exporters were already suffering loss in competitiveness owing to high inflation. Essentially, the interest parity condition and its implied relation between interest rates and exchange rates also demonstrate the complications faced by policymakers with free cross-border mobility of capital. Now we move on to fixed exchange rates and interest parity. So far we have discussed the case of flexible exchange rates. We saw how capital mobility leads to a link between interest rates and exchange rates that is captured in the interest parity condition discussed above. In many cases, countries opt for a fixed exchange rate regime mainly to avoid the currency volatility associated with a flexible rate regime. Given unrestricted capital flows and a fixed exchange rate, let us see what is implied by the interest parity condition. Once the exchange rate is fixed, say at rupees E per dollar, and the market has faith in the parity announced by the central bank, that is, agents believe the parity would hold in the future, the following would be true. First, F is equal to E, and secondly, E is equal to E raised to power E, that is, the forward rate as well as the expected exchange rate should be equal to the fixed parity. So the forward premium and expected currency depreciation would both be equal to 0. In this case, the CIP and UIP conditions are the same and the interest parity conditions imply the following, that is, I is equal to I raised to power F since V is equal to 0 or since F raised to power P is equal to 0. Clearly, the domestic interest rate has to be identical to the foreign rate of interest in case countries adopt a fixed exchange rate regime and lower restrictions on cross-border capital flows. What does this imply for policy making? In this case, monetary policy cannot be used independently to pursue national policy objectives because the domestic interest rate, an important monetary policy tool, has to be aligned with the foreign rate of interest. This means money supply becomes endogenous as it must passively adjust to capital outflows and inflows, and it has to be maintained at a level such that the domestic and foreign rates of interest are the same. Recall we had analyzed this case earlier when we discussed the Mundell-Fleming model and the role of monetary policy with fixed exchange rate and perfect capital mobility. So a system of fixed exchange rate imparts exchange rate stability, but it comes at a cost as countries have to give up monetary independence if they allow for capital mobility. This point is clearly demonstrated via the interest parity conditions. Now we have come to the conclusion, that is summary. In an open economy with few restrictions on international capital flows, agents have the option of holding both domestic and foreign assets. Foreign assets transactions lead to capital outflows and inflows that tend to affect the exchange rate when the economy has a flexible exchange rate system. Agents' decision to hold domestic vis-a-vis foreign assets depends on the relatively yields on these assets and on potential currency fluctuations. The interest parity condition captures the relation between interest rates and exchange rates in an open economy. When agents cover for exchange rate risk by entering into a forward contract, the covered interest parity condition shows that interest arbitrage would lead to equalization of risk-free returns on similar domestic and foreign assets. Risk-neutral individuals transact in foreign assets based on expected future interest rates. The uncovered interest parity condition states that with free capital mobility, if the market expects the currency of a country will depreciate in the future, then it has to offer a higher interest rate compared to the foreign countries. In case a country adopts a fixed exchange rate and unrestricted capital mobility, it has to maintain equality between domestic and foreign rates of interest. So with fixed exchange rates and free international capital mobility, countries lose independence of monetary policy or monetary policy becomes endogenous.